what you have is part of the self-preservation is to ignore 95% of the stuff that's out there. You have a person who's observing everything and remembers everything. He can't cross the street because he's fascinated by the green lights, by the cars, by the gravel, by the flies that are over there on the thing, by the fact that the car has a little blinker going. And if he pays attention to everything he saw, he'd be a life's risk to go across a crosswalk, crossing a street. So he learned to turn that off, turn that off, turn that. Watch for the green light, watch where the first foot goes down there, glance right and left, there's no car coming, and you get across the street safely. You have to ignore 99% of what's around you to be safe, to achieve what you want to achieve. What these things catalyze, letting you get access to those things you've been ignoring or have been denying.
There was a meeting last year when Dr. Hoffman came, and his opening sentence was, "You expected the shaman, you're going to get a chemist." When I was first asked by Dr. Robert Gordon McCutcheon to come here tonight and talk about whatever I wanted to do, my first impression, as long as I allowed my first impression, was to decline. I had, after all, I am a student of chemistry and of pharmacology and not really a student of philosophy and religion. And I felt I had probably contributed as much as I could last year when I took chalk to blackboard and drew hexagons and tryptamine rings and gave my impression of what on a molecule caused it to do what. But my wife intervened. Why not tell them just why you do what you do? It got me launched into an interesting question. I never had actually spoken to myself and said, why do you do what you do? The flippant answer is always at hand. Well, one does it because it's there to be done. The Mount Everest routine. I climb the mountain because it's there to be climbed. But that is, of course, not the reason I do the research I do. Whenever this question would come up in a seminar or during a panel discussion, I'd place special emphasis on the word psychotomimetic. The word has been used quite a bit today. A term that is usually used by the scientific community when they wish to speak about the psychedelic drugs. The term psychedelic does not find a good audience in the psychiatric or in the chemical or in the medical literature. It carries a meta-message of drug use, drug encouragement, drug proselytizing, and as a result, the word's not often encountered. In its origin, as was pointed out, it comes from psychoto, meaning in essence psychosis, and mimesis, meaning the imitation of. And this indeed is a term that very early in the work in this area that had been given these materials because they had been cast in the role of causing syndrome, causing symptoms that would reflect the character of mental illness. And it's felt by studying the effects of these materials in normal subjects, you might be able to glean some insight as to the mechanisms or at least the descriptions and definitions of this syndrome when seen in people who are spontaneously ill. This explanation, the search for new psychotomimetics, for materials that would be more exacting in definition of psychosis, is completely logical in that most of the hallucinogenics, the psychedelics that are known, can be classified into materials that are indoles, and there are many in this area, the tryptamines, the more convoluted carbolines, LSD as an ergot-type indole, or it can be classified as phenethylamines. And there are perhaps some 3 or 4 score that are in this classification. The analogs of mescaline, compound that's been mentioned several times, or the substitution variants of mescaline, or the alpha-methyl compounds that have given rise to the materials that are lumped chemically together as the amphetamines. And there are 2 principal neurotransmitters in the brain. One is an indole, and this is serotonin. One is a phenethylamine, namely dopamine. And it's very desirable from the point of the neurochemist to find pigeonholes that can classify things. Here we have a group of psychedelics that are all indoles, and we have a neurotransmitter that's indolic, serotonin. Here's a group that are all phenethylamines, and we have a neurotransmitter that's a phenethylamine. All we have to do is understand why all of these work here and all of those work there, and we shall now know how the neurotransmitters work in the brain. And once we know that, we'll be able to cure mental illness. Well, it's an appealing, and it has not been a particularly rewarding classification. And the explanation, beside being logical, is quite safe, because it's an unthreatening explanation. It's easily accepted by the academic and the administrative community. But the explanation is still not the explanation of why I do what I do. My work is indeed dedicated to the development of tools, but tools for quite a different purpose. And here's where I want to get quite away from chemistry and into some of my own personal thoughts. I'd like to lay a little background to establish a framework for these tools, and in part to define them, and in part to give emphasis to an urgency that I really feel associated with them. First, I am a very firm believer in the reality of a balance in all aspects of the human theater. When there seems to be a development, a move that away, somehow, very shortly, or almost in concert, there is a move this away that keeps things in some delicate balance. If there must be a dichotomization of concepts into good and evil, then all good seems to contain its unexpressed evil, and all evil is unexpressed good. Within the human mind, there coexists the eros, the life-loving, the self-perpetrating force, with the thanatos, the self-destructive death wish. Both are present in each of us, but are usually separated by a very difficult wall, a very difficult to penetrate wall, the unconscious. One definition of the tools I seek is that they may allow words of a vocabulary which might allow each human being to more consciously and more clearly communicate with the interior of his own mind and psyche. This may be called a vocabulary of awareness. A person who becomes increasingly aware of, and so begins to acknowledge, the existence of the two opposite contributors to his motives and decisions may begin to make choices which are knowledgeable. And the learning process that follows such choices is the path that leads to wisdom. But just as there is a balance within the mind that needs establishment, there is an interesting record of balances of the same sort in society. Let's look for a few minutes at some of the coincidences that have kept our human race in a rather precarious balance. Throughout the early centuries of the current millennium, there were carried out some of the most viciously inhuman wars that were known to man, all in the name of the forces of religion and the horrors of the Inquisition with its lethal intolerance of heresy. And yet it was during these dark years that the structure of alchemy was established. Not to change base metals into noble ones, as is often thought, but to acquire knowledge through the study of matter. The work of the alchemists extended up to the Age of Enlightenment, with the urges of rationalism and of skepticism. And it was always directed toward the learning process. The reward of alchemistic effort has been simply stated as the effort to achieve the transmutation of base metals into gold. But as Ralph pointed out just a bit ago, this is not the actual reward. The value was the doing and the redoing of the process of distillation, of sublimation, of condensation, of precipitation. It was a continual, ever more exact effort to understand these processes, that from the learning of the process, one would be able to find a unity between the physical and the spiritual world. It was the doing and the redoing itself that was the reward. In the last 100 years or so, this learning process has evolved into what we call science. However, there has been a subtle shift in the goal from the process itself to the results of the process. In this age of science, it is only the end result, the gold, that really matters. It is not the act of achieving, but the achievement itself that brings one the acknowledgement of his peers, that brings recognition from the outside world, that results in wealth and in influence and in power. And these end achievements, these results, show the same dichotomy of directions which was so evident from the previous centuries. For years, there had been no separation of values. Neither direction had taken the colors of good or for evil. Still, there were incredible coincidences of timing. For example, in 1895, Wilhelm Conrad von Lenken observed that when electricity was applied to an evacuated tube containing certain gases, a nearby plate covered with barium platinocyanide emitted a visible glow. And the next year, in 1896, Antoine-Henri Becquerel found that these same metal-producing emanations were being emitted from uranium. Radioactivity had been discovered. But it was just in the following year, at 11:45 a.m. on the 23rd of November of 1897, that Arthur Hefter consumed an alkaloid that he had isolated from the peyote, dumpling cactus, brought to the Western world by the irrepressible pharmacologist Louis Levine. As Hefter wrote in his notes, and this is a quotation following 150 milligrams of mescaline. From time to time, dots with the most brilliant colors floated across the field of vision. Later on, landscapes, halls, architectural scenes also appeared. Mescaline had also been discovered. During the 1920s and 1930s, both worlds, that of the physical sciences involving radiation and that of the psychopharmacological sciences involving psychotropic materials, continued to develop without any clear sense of polarity, without the mine is good and yours is evil duality that was soon to come. Radioactivity and radiation were becoming the mainstays of medicine. X-ray photography was invaluable in diagnosis, and radium therapy was broadly used in treatment. Controlled and localized radiation could destroy malignant tissue while sparing the host. And in the area of psychology, there were parallel developments. The theories of Freud and Jung were being developed into increasingly useful clinical tools and approaches to mental illness. And the basis of experimental psychology was laid in the pioneering studies of Pavlov. Another coincidence in timing, which in retrospect started a dividing of science onto separate paths, occurred during World War II. In the late 1942, Enrico Fermi and several other scientists at the University of Chicago demonstrated for the first time ever that nuclear fission could be achieved and could be controlled by man. The age of unlimited power and freedom from dependency upon our dwindling fossil reserves had begun. Just the next year, at 4:20 p.m. on the 19th of April, Albert Hofmann consumed a measured amount of a compound which he had first synthesized some 5 years earlier. As Hofmann subsequently reported, as a quotation following 250 micrograms, after the crisis of confusion and despair, I began to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and closing themselves in circles and spirals. LSD had also been discovered. But then, still, and up until the last decade, it was the rich promise of the nuclear age, first with the power and potential of fission, and later with the virtually limitless potential of fusion energy, that carried the banner and the hopes of man. And the area of the hallucinogenics was categorized as negative, psychosis-imitating, psychotomimetic. It was not until sometime in the 1970s, that a strange and a fascinating and a rather frightening reversal of roles took place. The knowledge of nuclear fission and fusion took on a death-loving aspect, with country after country joining the fraternity of those skilled in the capacity for the eradication of the human experiment. And to have such power leads to the threat to use such power, which in time will actually lead to its use. But, as I said earlier, when one thing develops, there seems to spring forth a balancing, a compensatory counterpart. This balance can be realized with the psychedelic drugs. What had been simply tools for the study of psychosis at best, or for escapist self-gratification at worst, suddenly assumed the character of tools of enlightenment and of some form of transcendental communication. If man's alter ego, his thanatos, had been entrusted with the imperpetual knowledge of how he can completely destroy himself and this extraordinary experiment, then some development must occur at the eros side of his psyche that will and must afford the learning of how to live with this perpetual knowledge. It is a communication between these two sides of the mind that requires an extraordinary vocabulary. Where do these words come from? The words of this vocabulary. All depend upon an intimate insight into the working of the human mind, but this can be approached in many ways. The study of religion, of meditation, of self-yielding, provides a peace, but in my mind also tends toward a retreat and hence a capitulation. The efforts to amalgamate the two sides of the mind, as seen in the Tao of Physics, and the rich findings of parallelisms between the Eastern and Western philosophies may eventually explain all and allow some unification for the human purpose. But I feel, along with many others, that the efforts being invested in the technology of destruction does not allow sufficient time. It is possibly only with the psychedelic drugs that words of vocabulary can be established which might tunnel through the subconscious between the conflicting aspects of the mind and psyche. It is here that I feel my skill lies. And this is exactly why I do what I do. Where do we stand as of today? In the last handful of years, the forces of government and nationalism have amassed an unprecedented arsenal of destructive power. The power is in the current arsenals of the world, if restructured into Hiroshima-strength weapons, to detonate one bomb every minute, on the minute, for the next 2 years. And the rationalized need to do so is becoming manifest at a frightening pace. But in the last handful of years, a number of tools of communication have increased at a like rate. There are currently nearly 200 psychedelic drugs known and described, some touching at one, some at another of the fibers that unify our minds. By learning each of their structures of sensory communication in turn, we might find a form of communication that would disarm our destructive compulsion. And indeed, what form of tools are now available to us? Some of the tools that are available, or rather that have been available, are the widely publicized drugs of psychopharmacology, such as mescaline, psilocybin, DOM, LSD. These drugs played a role in defining the transition between drugs as entertainment, escape, turn on, and drugs as instructive vehicles for learning, enlightenment, and insight, but at quite a price. They had a high profile at the time that the scheduled drug laws were written, and thus were made illegal and are not available. However, in their place there are now many, many other materials, some more limited in their instructive capacity, and some perhaps even richer. And for every one today, there will be 10 tomorrow. Let me describe a small sampling of the recently born materials a bit more in detail. These are examples with some quotations in some instances of experiments in which there have been actually definitions of some aspect of sensory teasing apart of the complex sensorium attack and effects that these materials can have. DIPT is an abbreviation of N,N-diisopropyltryptamine, a drug unique among the psychedelics in that it expresses a distortion in, or to an extent, a synthesis with the process of auditory integrity. It is perhaps one of the less available senses to be teased apart for special study. Many of the close relatives, as you well know, deal with the visual process and in some way will change or synthesize or modify the visual integrity, but a rather interesting distinction between the drug-induced psychosis and endogenous schizophrenia is that very often in the latter, the primary sensory character that is affected is the auditory influence. A quotation following 20 milligrams of DIPT. The telephone sounds partly underwater. Here are signs of a pitch change on radio. The absolute pitch down a major third. Chord on the piano sounds out of tune, quite flat. Music terrible, unlistenable. The other senses seem in no way affected. If I were deaf, I would have thought this an inactive drug. Several hours after ingestion of the material, this note. Hearing normal, piano back in tune. MDMA, or MDA, is abbreviation for 3,4-methylene-dioxy-methamphetamine. It's a tool of communication that has shown, in recent years, an extraordinary utility in opening communication between individuals. This has promoted its use in psychotherapy, but has given promise as well as a vehicle for intrapersonal communication. This particular drug has been used clinically in many applications, and these today in probably number in the thousands. And it has commanded a remarkably good record of positive results. A quotation following 120 milligrams. We kept up a lively conversation covering many interesting aspects of our various family relationships. The conversation was unusually insightful and free of defensiveness. And following a 40 milligram supplement at the 2-hour point, Jean glowed with energy, became very beautiful. We talked freely and openly. Every bush and plant looks utterly alive. I am entranced by a large rock. As I look at its surface, I see the surface of a planet with mountains and valleys. Little crystals of mica are like jewels. Another material, 2CB, is the abbreviation for 2,5-dimethoxy-4-bromophenethylamine. A tool and a word of vocabulary which ties the mental process directly and constructively into the physical soma. The analgesic effects experienced with many, if not most, of the psychedelic drugs are not present with 2CB. On the contrary, there is an increased body awareness of every kind, including skin sensitivity, heightened responsiveness to smells, tastes, to sexual stimulation. One experiences increased consciousness of physical health and energy, or, on the other hand, sharpened awareness of any body imbalance or discomfort. 2CB allows rich visual imagery and intense eyes-closed fantasy without cluttering up of the mental field with too many elaborations. A quotation following 20 milligrams. Along with the awareness of the body and the ability to deeply enjoy the fact that one is a physical as well as a spiritual being, the experience of 2CB allows exploration as far as one needs to go. There is at all times full connection with all parts of oneself, the emotional and the intellectual, the intuitive and the instinctual. It is a superb tool for learning and for growth. And 2CB allows one to recover baseline within 6 to 8 hours using a maximum dosage of 25 milligrams, usually lower in the area of 18 to 20. Another drug mentioned earlier, ketamine, is abbreviation for 2-orthochlorophenol 2-methylaminocyclohexanone, the antithesis of 2CB, in that it effectively separates the mind and the body. This allows the mind a separate and constructive state, apart from the physical groundings of the body. Although the primary clinical application of ketamine is as a dissociative anesthetic, an increasingly important direction of study is now being directed to the psychological loosening that it allows. MAL and CPM are abbreviations of the compounds that are fascinating analogs of mescaline, namely 4-methyl-3,5-dimethoxyphenethylamine and 4-cyclopropylmethyl-3,5-dimethoxyphenethylamine, two compounds that activate opposite sides of the sensorium. The former provokes an intense visual distortion at the retinal level, with consequential bizarre interpretations. The latter displays its effectiveness in the fantasy counterpart, seen only with the eyes closed. Following 65 milligrams of MAL, a quotation, within 2 hours, intense effect, beautiful, diuretic, good connections between parts of myself, continual fantasy and imagery, lovely experience of the erotic with husband. Around 12 hours, excellent solid sleep with clear, balanced dreams. Following 70 milligrams of CPM, at 2 hours, strong effect but no visual. Wonderful locking into music, deep loving, erotic very good, with eyes closed, intense, colorful fantasy, much like LSD at times. No sleep before 18 hours. Lest anyone should have the impression, by the way, that research in this area leads always to God and to insight and to deeper experiences in loving, let me mention an example of a compound called 4-TASB, which is 4-thiol-ethyl-3-ethoxy-5-methoxyphenethylamine. Following a 100 milligram exposure. At about 2 hours, pleasant and positive, peaceful feelings, very good humored. Later, sleep impossible until early morning, and then only about 2 hours. All next day could not rest or sleep. Feeling of nerve endings raw and active, anxiety over heartbeat, frightening effects on nervous system, depression, back of neck sore from tension. My first experience of being able to detect what felt like continual electrical impulses between nerve endings. Had the impression that if I allowed the wrong sequence of images to flow in my mind, I might experience some sort of convulsion, or at least a kind of mental shock or shorting out. When I tried to sleep, eyes closed fantasies became intensely negative and threatening. I could not smooth out the nervous system. Felt very vulnerable. Do not repeat. Alpha-O-DMS is abbreviation of 5-methoxy-alpha-methyltryptamines, an analog of a neurotransmitter serotonin that has been tailored chemically to allow it to enter into the CNS, into the brain. It is a very potent indole psychedelic that touches closely on those areas involved with primal energies. Several researchers experienced dreams of catastrophic events after exploring this material. One researcher, however, had a dream which involved as a complete science fiction scenario. He found it absolutely enjoyable and is still thinking of writing it up and sending it into a publisher. These are only about a half a dozen or so of many scores of fascinating compounds that are now available for the study of this developing vocabulary. This is where we are at the moment. Some materials show incredible promise, and some suggest caution. But what might we expect to emerge in the future? Let's look at the past history of other areas of psychotropic chemistry. A few decades ago, it was marveled at that drugs such as the opiates, including morphine and heroin, meperidine, could have such an exacting influence on the brain's integrity. Then it became known that there were natural factors in the brain that had these actions, and that there were specific sites in the brain that were pre-designed to respond to them. There were the enkephalins and their fragmented portions known as the endorphins, which were derived from the cephalic process and related to morphine. These met a person's need for the suppression of pain. Perhaps there are enkadelics from the psychedelics, and specific N-escalins from mescaline yet to be discovered that might relate to these communicative factors, which might be the natural which might be connected and eventually related to the natural receptor sites in the brain for transcendental communication. Their structures may someday be known. Their functions may someday be understood. There are a multitude of tenuous threads that tie together the fragile structure of the human spirit. The life-giving with the death-demanding side. The exalted voice with the mundane. The strongly centered self with the drive toward dispersion and loss of center. These all coexist in all of us. But there is an essential blockade between these inner worlds, which I truly feel can be penetrated only with the words and the tools and the understanding that may be most easily obtained through the area of psychedelic experiences. William Blake said in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, "Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul, discerned by the five senses. The chief inlets of soul in this age, energy is the only life, and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight." These are responses to a heartfelt need for some vocabulary, to allow the establishment of a dialogue that might diffuse the accelerating mad moves toward extinction. My personal philosophy might well be lifted directly from Blake. I must create a system or be slaved by another man's. I may be wrong, but I must do what I'm doing. And I will do what I can as fast as I can.
My personal preference is I like psychedelic, because even though the term carries all this cultural baggage, and everything's psychedelic, that's kind of something left over from the 60s. But in the strict sense, psychedelic means mind manifesting. And I like the term because it leaves it open. I mean, these substances certainly manifest the mind in some aspect, and we don't have any argument with that. But how they manifest it, depends on set and setting. And like these other terms, sort of are more specifically related to set and setting. And they also show how difficult it is to really linguistically kind of put this in a box, characterize what they do. Sometimes they're mystical, sometimes they're induce psychosis, sometimes they don't do much of anything at all, but they always manifest the mind in some way. So I like psychedelic if it could just be divorced from all the connotations that it's come to have in our culture.